Hi Adel, how are you?
Hi, Malihe. How are you?
I'm well. I'm well. We have been talking about some themes that we should discuss in the monthly media segments, and we thought that the new developments in Al Jazeera are worth discussing for what it means and why it's happening now. And that is, a few days ago, Al Jazeera launched a new platform called Rightly. And according to the network's press release, Rightly is a new US based digital platform that will generate content for audiences currently underrepresented in today's media environment, meaning young Republicans who, quote, feel left out of the mainstream media. Rightly's soft launch happened on February 25th with its first show, Right Now with Stephen Kent, a right wing commentator and a Tea Party supporter. And Rightly's editor in chief is Scott Norvell. He was on the team that launched Fox News Channel in 1996. But before we diving in and talking about this new adventure by Qatar, I think it would be useful to spend some time and look at the network's past and why it was created in the first place. And you are in a position to give us some insight. You have been following this network closely for many years. You co authored a book on Al Jazeera with Muhammad El Nawawi called Al Jazeera, the story of the network that is rattling governments and redefining modern journalism. So let's go back to the beginning. We don't have much time. This could take days, of course, but let's do as much as we can. Talk about why this network was born in the first place and why Qatar saw the need to spend billions of dollars getting into the media world back in 1996.
Thank you, Malihe. Okay, so wow, I can't believe it's been that long, as
Mhm.
surprising as it seems. So Al Jazeera came into being in 1996, and at the outset, it identified itself as a different product. And by Al Jazeera, I mean Al Jazeera Arabic. It was an exclusively Arabic language, all news, 24-hour news network broadcasting out of Qatar. Qatar is a small peninsular state in the Gulf, and a country that at the time didn't really have much political weight or leverage. But during that period, it was fairly evident that the new emir of Qatar, Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, at the time, was increasingly at odds with the leaders in his immediate vicinity, with the Saudi kingdom, and tried to carve out a slightly more independent foreign policy than his predecessors, namely his father, who he toppled in a bloodless coup while he was seeking treatment in Europe. During that time, it just happened on the heels of the collapse of a BBC slash Saudi television venture with a company called Orbit, where BBC World Service were trying to launch their first ever non-English language news broadcaster in Arabic, with studios in London, bankrolled predominantly by Saudi funds. And within a matter of days, a topic which was perceived to be immensely thorny by the Saudi kingdom, namely the discussion around public executions, was considered a no-no. So there was editorial interference at the outset, where the Saudi funders said, if this goes to air, we're pulling the plug. Sure enough, the independent journalists based in London at the time, trying to carve out their own sort of freedom of expression, or freedom of the press, if you will, decided that they would go ahead with the broadcast. And literally overnight, the money was withdrawn, was retracted essentially, and all operations came to a standstill, and the network became defunct. So even before, it was essentially a stillbirth of a network. It was around that time that the Emir of Qatar decided to adopt, if you will, and transport the nucleus of reporters from their London offices to Qatar to start a network, and basically gave them what sounded like free reign and an editorial license to produce journalism in the manner that they see fit. So
But in the
that's
beginning, Al Jazeera Arabic was talking to the Arab world.
absolutely Arabic audience, Arabic speaking audiences, Arab public at that particular juncture in time. This is like the mid 90s. So this is pre 9/11. It was a period of, I can't say relative tranquility. Iraq was under embargo. It was a complicated time. The Palestinian cause was very fraught. So it was a difficult time. But it was the first time that there was 24-hour all news reporting. There was on the ground reporting of conflicts and incidents. It looked very different from its media landscape at the time, all of which were controlled very heavily by the various governments in the region. So this looked like an independent network coming from a country that was largely unknown and had little clout. So the mystery in and of itself created intrigue. And very quickly became a place where there was a lot of magnetism. Anybody who wanted to do independent, creative journalism that ruffled the feathers of those in power and in their respective countries gravitated towards Qatar. And it was around that time that Mohammed and Nawawi and I, began exploring and thinking about and eventually writing about Al Jazeera. So this is the Al Jazeera that we described. It was even before the English network was
Yeah.
launched. So it was a breath of fresh air. Um, in the media world in the media realm in the Arab world, and that was immensely exciting. Along comes 9/11, and Al Jazeera is in the limelight. Everybody's paying attention to it. It's in all the right places at all the right times, and is in
They
a
got an
position to cover.
interview, the first interview with Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, the first interview with Osama bin Laden post 9/11, and various. I mean, the first footage coming out of the U.S. bombings in Afghanistan, the first attack on Iraq in 2003. So all of these things being documented and broadcast live to televisions across the region, and picked up, the exclusive footage being picked up by Western networks, and that became the opening salvo. So Al Jazeera consecrated itself as a platform for independent, freewheeling, adventurous journalism that doesn't exist in the Arab region.
So
And then
in
things change.
def, and we'll talk about that, but um, in the beginning, when it was mainly appealing to the Arab world and
Yes.
talking to the Arab world, um, what was the political message they were trying to get through?
The political message at the time was a fairly, generic, agreeable commitment to democratization, the importance of public interest, a sort of an open call for freedom of expression, a recognition of the necessity to diversify political options. They created a platform for dissidents of all political stripes, from the far, I would shouldn't say from the far right at the time, but I would say from the center left to center right. So essentially opening up the political spectrum. That seemed to be the agenda, without any real commitment to any specific movement or collective or group, but effectively opening up the sphere of what is acceptable.
And how did Qatar think? I mean, what did they think with opening up sort of the space?
I mean, it
Um,
drew attention to
for-
them. It drew a lot of attention to them, and I think it one of the things that we argued at the time was that Al Jazeera was more well known than Qatar. So it became Qatar, became the capital of this country called Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera was became a successful brand, and projected Qatar as a much more substantial, weighty country than it actually is in sort of the grand scheme
that's
of things.
opening up, and it
Yeah.
probably was kind of more appealing to the Western governments.
Absolutely. And also, incidentally, around that time, we began to see Qatar being open for, not for business, but open for U.S. military involvement. So At the time when it was the discourse out of Al Jazeera was becoming increasingly critical of U.S. military misadventures in the region, the U.S. military misadventures were
Okay,
happening
okay.
from Qatar.
Yes,
So
yeah.
that's when Al Udeid military base was set up, and so literally within a few tens of kilometers away from Al Jazeera's headquarters was Central Command of the U.S. military, which helped launch all the sort of the military operations in Iraq. And also working closely with Afghanistan, and to this day, it remains a very critical military post for the U.S. armed forces. So you could see how the Qatari government begins to um, sort of, how do I say it, kind of like support every horse in the race, criticizing the United States military and their involvement, while at the same time giving them safe harbor to operate from their territory. So it was that approach that began to complicate the relationship between Qatar and not only its neighbors but the world at large, and also began to invite scrutiny of Al Jazeera. So what is Al Jazeera doing to respond to criticism of the presence of military forces, U.S. military forces on their territory, while at the same time accusing other countries of being allies of the United States?
And I think what happened during the 2010-2011 Arab uprisings sort of unraveled Al
Absolutely.
Jazeera in ways that the network had not
Definitely.
predicted. And the Arab uprisings were actually a high point in Al Jazeera's history. I mean, they had reporters, really good reporters, I should say,
Hmm.
on the ground. I interviewed several of them, including people like Shirin Tadros, who was present on the ground in Egypt and other capitals in the Arab world. But there were biases as well when it came to Yemen, when it came to Bahrain, when it came to protests in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, and it became very evident. And especially in Libya, where they called some of those militias martyrs. So it became evident that they are not sort of there is no the editorial independence is not there, and people are restricted. And I remember I spoke with some reporters from Al Jazeera um, during the war, I mean, in the aftermath of the war in Yemen. And they were telling me that sometimes when they want their transcript has to be sent to Doha, Qatar, in order to be checked, and then it can be released and recorded. So I think it became controversial in the aftermath and even really during the Arab uprisings because they sort of the picked and chose which ones they wanted to cover and all that. And they have had also a very kind of a delicate dance with the Iranian regime throughout their history. So, can you talk a little bit about during and the after and the aftermath of the Arab uprising,
Mhm.
and how did that impact the network itself?
Mhm.
And because I know that they lost some talent, and then of course then came the budget cuts, and then they shed some more people. Um, so just go through that a bit more.
Sure, sure. No, it really is an absolutely critical juncture. But if you don't mind, I'm going to take us back a little bit prior to the Arab Spring, when the network recognized the importance, or I should say, I keep saying the network, but in reality, we're talking about the Qatari government deciding to
Exactly.
invest in different strategies. It is a mistake, I think, a clear mistake to dissociate the network from the Qatari government. At the end of the day, not unlike RT or CCTV, Al Jazeera is a government broadcaster out of Qatar,
Press TV.
or
Uh,
Press TV, absolutely, or Press TV, or Al
Public
Arabiya, or
television
so
operator.
all
Yeah,
these
around
networks.
here.
Absolutely. So, having said that, it was around 2003, just prior to the U.S. military invasion of Iraq that Al Jazeera began to invest in an English language broadcaster. And I have to say that many of us thought at the time that the journalistic commitment, and the stellar work being done by the reporters at the time needed to be transferable and accessible to English speaking audiences and not be limited to Arab audiences alone. But it was also at that time that Al Jazeera began as an overarching media company to speak out of both sides of its mouth. So often what happened was that the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing, and what the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. So the Arabic network developed its own had its own audience sort of entrenched, and developed media content to appeal to specific sort of indicators of where the audience lies politically. And the English language network was trying to reach English speaking audiences, not just in the global south but also in Europe and North America and elsewhere. So it had a much more expansive audience to cover, so the net was cast much wider, and it sounded a lot more cosmopolitan and perhaps more left leaning. But along comes the Arab Spring, and Al Jazeera is at that point one of the largest, international broadcasters, even larger in scope and scale and funding than CNN. So you've got bureaus all over the world, including the Arab world, and they're broadcasting both in Arabic and English. And so the uprisings begin in Tunisia, which they covered on the Arabic network. Once they arrive in Egypt, and subsequently in Syria, in Yemen, in Bahrain, we begin to see Al Jazeera having the front row seat, as you described, with journalists reporting what was happening there. But very quickly, we started to see the incredible complexity of the political spectrums in each of those countries, and
Yeah.
that's what made, I would argue, that became Al Jazeera's Achilles heel. They had to take decisions as to where they stand vis-a-vis the various political conflictual situations. So on Egypt, Al Jazeera decided, and I should say more so Al Jazeera Arabic than English, they decided that they needed to anchor themselves in what they perceived to be the most successful political force at the time, which was the Muslim Brotherhood. In Syria, they anchored themselves in support of the opposition to Assad, which very quickly became armed insurgents. And later on, we began to see the radicalization of the opposition in Syria. So the Arabic station became, uh, without exaggeration, quite supportive of organizations like Jabhat al-Nusra, which is
Definitely.
allied with Al Qaeda. In Yemen, because of their alliance with Saudi Arabia, it was no go. You couldn't touch Yemen for a large part of that period, because Yemen was the stomping grounds of their then allies, Saudi Arabia. On Bahrain, they absolutely shut down coverage as soon as Saudi Arabia entered Bahrain and closed and destroyed Pearl Roundabout. That's when Al Jazeera decided, you can't go, we can't go there, we're not covering it, and Bahrain is not a revolution.
And
So
one of the when they were criticized about their silence on Bahrain, one of the top people at Al Jazeera said that the reason that we have not been covering Bahrain, and this happened during the 2011, um, he said because we don't have a bureau there, they shut us down. So that's why it's not that we have been silent; it's that we are not capable of reporting from Bahrain. So that basically that's the narrative they created.
Mali, I'm glad you're saying that, because in retrospect, that is a very sham justification, because Al Jazeera has reported from many places where their bureaus have been shut down. Al Jazeera's bureaus have been shut down in Arab capitals more than any other network in the region, and yet they were able to continue broadcasting. Heck, they've had all of their staff members kicked out of Egypt, but they've been reporting from Egypt, or on Egypt at the very least, for much of the last 8 years. So, and they've been doing that since day one. They've had there have been diplomatic spats as a result of Al Jazeera, journalists being, deported or arrested or detained or sentenced. There's so many attacks against Al Jazeera's journalists. It never stopped them from covering a particular place. And Bahrain is essentially in Qatar's backyard. It's a stone's throw away. You could see Bahrain from Qatar. So you wouldn't need to do a lot of covering to cover it. And the footage was there. They just decided not to air it. The same is true of Yemen. Um, Yemen was a concerted decision to avoid. Now, of course, as soon as their political spat with Saudi Arabia unfolded, then Yemen became fair game, as was Bahrain, as were all these other places. So you could see how the editorial decision making happening in Qatar was driven by the Qatari foreign policy interests vis-a-vis all of these different conflicts and situations. But Al Jazeera, for all intents and purposes, took sides, and when they took sides in these various sort of revolutionary circumstances, they gained audience shares, and they
Yeah.
lost audience shares.
Yeah.
But they became an arbiter of what constitutes a viable political entity, or what is a viable government, or what is a government versus what is a regime. And that's where things started to get really muddied. I would say that the Syrian conflict was possibly the final nail in the coffin, because they were in the Arabic station more so than the English, but they were so immensely enthusiastic about the opposition, and they were cheerleading for them almost to a point where it was they were playing a game of brinksmanship and political theater on air, with the expectation that the that Bashar al-Assad was going to fall. And when it didn't pan out that way, they had to backtrack, and it became a real sort of embarrassment, the way they covered things and who they decided to ally themselves with. And so it's been very, very difficult for them to rehabilitate their image in the region with their adversaries. Nevertheless, they've also dug their heels deep in in the support of sort of centrist Islamist groups across the region. I would argue that Al Jazeera, since 2012, 2013, in Arabic, the Arabic language network, and it's important to specify this, has been appealing to the Middle East's right wing. You know, these
Mm.
are right wing forces in the region. So when we are surprised, the English language followers of the Al Jazeera English would find this quite surprising, because they're so accustomed to the network being almost left leaning, but the Arabic language, sister organization is predominantly right leaning. So this is where they decide to carve out their audiences depending on circumstances.
And then when they opened up a bureau in Washington, D.C.,
So Al Jazeera America, the headquarters was in DC and New York, but they had bureaus across the country.
across the country, and then AJ Plus that bought
Yeah.
the Al Gore's current TV building in San Francisco.
Hmm.
I remember I visited that place when they were trying to figure out exactly what their market base is going to be, who's going to be listening, especially when AJ Plus was trying to attract a lot of young people. And I was surprised that they were even taking surveys
Hmm.
amongst kids to see what they like. So they really wanted to go after young people, kids, just create a different sort of a techie, Silicon Valley themed, media outlet. But they were not successful. They were not able to penetrate the US market. And after 3 years, they had to shut it down and they moved. So now, when it comes to audiences in the US, they all have to watch it on the internet, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you're mentioning this, because this was we don't talk about it, but it is effectively one of the most lamentable sort of media blunders of modern times, because we're talking about a network that cost $500 million to get license and access to studios, and another 500 million. We're talking about $1 billion before operation even kickstarts, just to get access to the US market. And then once the operation is up and running, then the product itself is largely at odds with the original brand of the network, because it's trying to appeal to audiences that are largely at odds with the corporate brand.
Mm.
And so Al Jazeera doesn't produce a resonant message. it tries to, it looks like it's mimicking, CNN or Fox News in some instances, or maybe like a BBC variation on
But
American
we're also
programming.
trying to fill a gap because
Absolutely.
when it comes to corporate cable TV networks, it's about sensationalism. It's about quick and fast news update by and headlines. But Al Jazeera English, Al Jazeera America, AJ, I mean, they spend time on developing
Yes.
documentaries, going to different parts of the United States, from Louisiana to Harlem. I mean,
Yes.
they did so
Absolutely.
many wonderful documentaries, and by good journalists, good reporters, and they some of them they received well-deserved awards.
Yes.
But again, we're not talking about um, specific reporters or what was covered. We are doing a sort of a more structural
Yes.
analysis of the network, and I think that's how we can understand its path and its
Hmm.
evolution and sort of the
Absolutely.
topology of this network. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think you're absolutely correct in saying that Al Jazeera, because of its objective of trying to create opportunities for journalists who want to do hard-hitting investigative work, or work that has a real commitment to social justice, that they attracted this kind of talent, and they were able to produce really stellar work that, I mean, as you said, it's the accolades are plenty, whether it's Pulitzers or Edward R. Murrow awards or many others. So so they've done fantastic work, but as you said, the structural problem is that the decision making happening out of Qatar has very little appreciation for quality journalism. It is really about tapping into audiences, not for the purposes of profit, because God forbid, Qatar couldn't care less about generating profit. It has more to do with political influence and clout. So the fact that you're attracting a bunch of disenchanted young people who are on the left because of poor water issues in Michigan,
Yeah.
or voter fraud in
Homelessness
Texas,
or
or
yeah.
homelessness, or this is not, this is almost like uh, collateral good journalism compared to the objective that the Qatari government has for Al Jazeera America, which is to really tap into the beltway and to have influence in Congress, and to have influence among lawmakers and lobbyists and the image makers in the U.S. So Al Jazeera America, I mean, it ended up failing, not just because it wasn't not just because of the journalism. In fact, in spite of good journalism,
Yes,
it failed
exactly.
because the Qataris had a different objective for it. It failed because it was also very poorly planned, in the sense that at the time there was a real recognition that digital journalism or online journalism is what matters most. But they had decided to invest in cable news. So AJ Plus became the attempt to save to save the network from the mistakes of Al Jazeera America. So AJ Plus, all of a sudden became the main platform, and Al Jazeera America quickly started to disintegrate and eventually was shut down. And some of the money was redirected, or sort of, I should say, invested into AJ Plus. But by that point, AJ Plus had also become increasingly obsolete, as many other products began to replicate it or produce what they do well, and perhaps do it with more political leverage, with more ideological sort of leaning, whether it's right or left. So Al Jazeera AJ Plus was left kind of standing there, claiming, have been the first to do so, and to do so well, produce sort of digital, like really well packaged digital news and news commentary. But eventually they were eclipsed by their competitors, whether it's HuffPost Live or Now, or so many others, or Vice. So eventually it was nothing came became of it. So all this to say that the experiments in reaching U.S. audiences have all failed, and we can explore why they failed. But this is where we're at. And watching Al Jazeera English in the United States today has far less appeal than it did back then, because even that product is no longer unique, no longer has any primacy,
Exactly.
and the audience share is really split among a huge plethora of news options.
And I think with podcasts and the way that people consumption patterns, I should say, because a lot of people really consume the news, instead of
Yes.
trying to understanding and spend time with it critically.
Hmm.
We have become news consumers, less more ignorant. Um,
Absolutely.
so so I think they sort of they were behind the curve.
Hmm.
And there were too many players in the market, and we can see that especially with podcasts right now, that how difficult it is to sort of penetrate the market,
Yes.
the podcast market. So they're hiring companies, so some podcasts can get some attention and tractions amongst
Hmm.
zillions of podcasts that we have in the market right now. So let's fast forward to this announcement.
Yes.
I read it first in The Guardian on February 23rd that Al Jazeera launched, is planning to launch this Rightly network online, podcast, YouTube, social media. And then on 25th, they had their first program. Um, And then we see this backlash. So everything happened in a matter of a couple of days.
Hmm.
Then we see this backlash from 100 staff at Al Jazeera, wrote an open letter. It was leaked to The Guardian. And they basically said that this goes against Al Jazeera's mission. So what happened? Why do you think they decided to um, penetrate this time the right wing market? Because that's also populated at the moment.
Yes. I think that it's a good question. It's hard to get into the minds of the executives and their decision making, but it's fairly evident that they knew this was not going to go well with their existing cadre of journalists and media managers in the company, because this is the first time that we see two Al Jazeera products in the same language in competition with each other, or producing competing narratives, if you will. So, historically, if you wanted to reach the left and the right, and you're an Al Jazeera product, you operate across languages. So, right wing audiences in the Middle East communicate to them in Arabic, left leaning audiences in the West communicate to them in English. But to have the same like the same company produce two products, one that appeals to the center left and one that appeals to the right wing, is a conflictual situation, especially if it's associated with the same company. And so Al Jazeera presumably must have looked at the incredible skepticism, the rift in skepticism between Republicans and Democrats vis-a-vis the media. I mean, we've been hearing about the liberal media in right wing talk shows and on Fox News and among right wing commentators since at least the mid 90s. So that idea has now become very much entrenched. Trump drove that wedge home with his constant berating of journalism and the media establishment, mainstream media as a whole, to varying degrees. And on his way out, he also threw a few punches at Fox News. So basically, if you're center right all the way to, like, white nationalist radicals and proud boys, you look at the media scene and nothing looks appealing except for these um, complicated online platforms that mass produce conspiracy theories that end up parroting your interpretation of the world. And
But you know,
so,
Al Jazeera's mission was to be the voice of the voiceless.
yes, yes.
Okay. Mediate spoke with some journalists, at Al Jazeera Network, and one of them said that Al Jazeera is not political, it's not partisan, and it's not ideological. And I was thinking that it's really interesting that there is this sort of a distinction, constructed, really falsely constructed distinction between government controlled media outlets such as RT, TRT in Turkey, Press TV, um, and then this corporate owned, quote unquote, Republican versus Democrat versus independent. This is how we sort of label these outlets, and then they become ideological,
Hmm.
as opposed to that. So we see how so many prominent veteran journalists are working for RT or for um, the the Chinese
CCTV,
channel,
yeah,
CCTV.
or
So
CGN, I think is what it's
CGN,
called. Yeah,
yeah.
CGN, China Global Network,
So
CGTN.
it's also interesting that the reporters make this distinction
Hmm.
that until now they were non-ideological and they had the editorial freedom, but now they have become partisan and they are getting into a fractured political space that they're not supposed to as a media outlet or as journalists. What do you think about that? This distinction that is being made.
I think I very much empathize with these journalists because they're desperately trying to protect their the the efficacy and the credibility and the reputation and the legitimacy of their work. But I would very staunchly disagree with that assessment because I
Mhm.
think Al Jazeera has never been nonpartisan. Al Jazeera has been partisan from day one. That's why they stand out. That's why they stood out. That's why they carved out a space for themselves in the media landscapes, both of the Middle East and the world at large. Their reporters on a day to day basis are making decisions around partisanship. The idea of that they're, and this is something that we described in our book. Um, about Al Jazeera from day one, that they would play with this notion that we called contextual objectivity, that you're objective, but you appear to be presenting every side of the story. So when you present every side of the story, it makes it seem like you are nonpartisan, but in reality, you also are privileging some opinions at the expense of others. So, for instance, on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, they do. I mean, Al Jazeera English speaks to Israeli officials and Palestinian
Yeah,
activists, and all the. There's a plethora of different possibilities, but the tone of the messaging is, unlike most other mainstream media in the United States and Western Europe, is largely sympathetic of the Palestinian disenfranchisement and supportive of Palestinian self-determination. So we can begin to see that the network is partisan and had been partisan all along. But the appeal to nonpartisanship is it becomes a justification for reaching more audiences that weren't part of your original conception of the network. So I would argue that this is sort of like the early days of journalism in the US under Benjamin Franklin, where, back in the day, networks were called, the Tallahassee Democrat or the Albany Republican, or like they were affiliated with political entities and parties and had their clear lines. But as soon as they decide to reach more audiences, they're like, oh, okay, well, we need to tone down our coverage. And then objectivity becomes a convenient tool to be able to tap into more audiences. What makes it difficult for me to accept in the case of Al Jazeera is they're not even doing it for profit. They're
yeah,
doing it because they're trying to reach audiences that will allow them to gain clout in the United States political sphere as a foreign nation. So it's not because they are leftist trying to reach the left or rightist trying to reach the right. They're just trying to access more audiences so that it can translate into more listenership and more influence in this domestic market that appears to be largely impenetrable. So they're looking for kind of homegrown journalism that is sort of camouflaged, you know. In reality, it's Al Jazeera, but the smoke screen kind of hides it. If you don't mind, Maliha, I'll give one quick example of how that worked successfully for the Al Jazeera company. A number of years ago, they decided that they wanted to reach sports audiences around the world. So they launched a network called Be In Sports. And in a span of a few years, Be In Sports became the go-to network with exclusive, of course, they can buy exclusive rights, right? When
I
you have deep
remember
pockets, you
that.
can buy exclusive rights. You buy exclusive rights to the NFL, to the NHL, to MLS, to European football, to soccer, to this, to that. Before you know it, you've covered the world over, and you're selling a box that allows people to access by subscription this content. All the while, nobody has any idea that beIN Sports is a Qatari owned network that is a subsidiary of Al Jazeera. It's not until everybody has it that you realize, it has some connection with the rest of this constellation of media products. So this is what they did successfully with beIN Sports, which is to shield the audiences from the funders and the bankrollers and the state, which is an extractionist state that relies largely on natural gas revenues. You shield that and you hide the political messaging, and you're able to break into new markets. But with Rightly, it's almost impossible to do that because it's front and center. This is an Al Jazeera network that is at odds with what appears to be the original mission of the network. And the problem is that not only are they in conflict, they're in competition with each other. And then before you know it, you've got a mutiny on your hand inside the network itself, where people are, senior editors, senior journalists are convulsing over possibly being aligned with a station it's almost like imagining Ted Turner deciding to create sort of a right of center network that is a subsidiary of his company to compete with CNN.
And I watched the first episode right now with the Stephen Kent program, and and I was telling you before that they are basically using the toxic and racist rhetoric of the Trump era and the Republican Party, sort of a dog whistle, radical left, radical leftist media. Um, they're radicalizing the youth and kind of lamenting the Reagan era and the old Republican Party of small government and conservatism, real conservatism, but using the sort of the most updated rhetoric. So they are, I think the more we learn, we realize that it is really adding to the
Mhm.
toxicity of the ecosystem that we are witnessing right now. And I think the key question remains for many of us, it's what is the role of journalists and how we should create independent, publicly funded media outlets, and how we should create spaces where we don't have to people don't have to flock to press TV and RT, because they are one of the main sources of misinformation and lies. They are. But a lot of people that we might even respect, they show up there, and they some of them work there. So I think this also is complicating not just the Al Jazeera brand, but also the type of journalism that has become now the of extension of what they branded themselves
Mhm.
as the voice of the voiceless.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you're saying that because back when Muhammad al Nawawi and I you called the book "The Network That's Rattling Governments and Redefining Modern Journalism," in all frankness, I don't think we would have anticipated the kind of impact that Al Jazeera has had, both in the positive and the negative. In doing so, they are entrenching the idea that the pursuit of audience is so necessary that one could forego any journalistic principles whatsoever or any commitment to what is best for the public, the idea of public interest, or even the notion of social responsibility. So it differs in no way from the blind sort of chase for profit. You this is what's catchy. This is what we're going to give them. It's very much market driven, and it really it sort of reeks of racism, bigotry, sexism, misogyny, and all the problematic things that exist in the political spectrum. Most of the journalists at Al Jazeera, English, I should say, are committed to challenging those very problems, and they've demonstrated that in a lot of their work over the past 10 or so years. So to watch this, I can imagine and I could feel their outrage and I imagine that over the next little while, of course COVID doesn't help, but presumably many of them might be looking for jobs elsewhere because they no longer believe in the brand itself. But if they were able to look further upstream to see what the same brand is producing in the Middle East, they probably would have anticipated what is happening today. Your argument about public media I could not agree more. In a very fundamental way, this raises the perennial question that we've always asked, as anybody who pays attention to or works in journalism, and you know this, given your experience and profession over a number of years and addressing so many issues, that you have to follow the money. You have to figure out who's behind these operations, who's funding them, and the argument that Al Jazeera executives have been making all along is that there is a firewall between the networks and the Qatari government. But we've now discovered that is absolutely not the case. The people who are calling the shots are in the royal court, essentially deciding, let's go here, let's go there, let's shut this down, let's open this, because they're the ones with the money. The tens of billion, hundreds of billions of dollars spent on Al Jazeera thus far, a corporation that is not in any way generating profit. Al Jazeera loses money. Every network broadcasting out of the Middle East loses money. It doesn't generate, and Al Jazeera is no exception to that. But since they're losing money, the person who's writing those checks is calling the shots, and they've decided that this is the direction that they need to take. So it's a
Yeah,
clear
and they
indication.
are coming up. I mean, today, for
Yeah,
example, I was just going through some Twitter accounts, and they are trying to come up with this very sanitized um, sort of PR campaign of
mhm.
what it is. Using very kind of generic words,
The
um,
conversation or something like something other
conversation,
conversation.
reaching out broader audience, and just all these generic buzzwords that really don't mean anything. But I'm not sure if they are going to be successful in this adventure, or this is going to be just another cash cow for a number of white Republican far right pundits to sit around a table and talk nonsense.
Absolutely. I think you're totally right. Um, Time will tell, but I imagine that rightly will not be successful. It won't be able to capture the imagination of center right audiences in the American South or anywhere else in the country for that matter. They have products that are much more quote unquote authentic, more connected to their plight, their perspective, their ideology, their worldview, and their experiences more so than not. And also, many of them realize they're one Google search away from discovering what Al Jazeera's history is and the Qatari government's history. And so, if this is a network coming from a country that is perceived to be supporting, Islamist perspectives in the Middle East, or was responsible for this media product or that media product, or criticizing the Republican Party here or there, then that's it. That's a stigma that they won't be able to shake off. So Al Jazeera's brand is associated with an adversarial perspective to these audiences. So I don't think it's going to go anywhere. But as you said, it is a way to put money in the pockets of right wing pundits who are producing toxicity. And that alone is sufficient to cause substantial damage to the political sphere. The last thing that we want is more of this drivel. I mean, it's really deeply problematic, and so inadvertently, or advertently, I should say, the Qatari government is supporting these discourses
Yeah.
and going to contribute to them.
And
Um,
and also I think it becomes more frustrating because this is happening at a time that the pandemic has exposed so many social and economic ills of this country. And I think what we need right now um, is for more journalists to really dive deep and try to understand the society and what the people needs, mm,
yes.
and the intersection of sort of society and politics and economy. But then we see more of these sort of adventurous projects coming on, and they are even complicating the situation more and creating more of what is becoming a sort of a you know given fact of culture wars.
Hmm. Absolutely.
And I think that also is really problematic. But then again, it remains to be seen. We don't know. It's just been a few days.
Yes.
And but from what I can tell, and even some of the media um, personalities on Al Jazeera, I watch one of them. I'm not going to name names, but it's very interesting that the program that is supposed to criticize and critique the media is also becoming part of this PR campaign
Okay.
to introduce um, this right wing um, branch of Al Jazeera to the wider audience.
Hmm.
So I think I think this has to make us think about the ramifications for journalism, even on a very, very small level, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, and how we can challenge this and how we can create, as I said, a space where we can have publicly funded,
Mhm.
independent journalism that can really get as close to the truth as possible.
Absolutely. I can't agree with you more. I would also add that, in the grand scheme of things, I believe that the unit of great journalism is great journalists.
Mm,
So great journalists exist in this, at the front line of this complicated confrontation. And I wanted to salute the Al Jazeera journalists who decided to, in some instances, take a huge risk in possibly losing their jobs at a time of incredible lack of, stability in both the market and in our livelihoods, to confront this situation. Many of them have been unabashed in their criticism. They're taking to the social media to confront, sometimes their executives in all of this, PR marketing stuff. And I have to say that their valiance is highly admirable. Perhaps that's a positive outcome, that for once the Al Jazeera sort of news corps, if you will, are um, are beginning to have internal conversations
mm,
about what it means to be doing their work and what it means to be aligned with and affiliated with networks that don't represent their best interests. I've been harping on about this for a number of years now, that Al Jazeera English's journalists need to pay attention to what the Arabic network is busy doing. But with the language barrier being what it is, it became really difficult to do so. Now they get to be privy to how, you know, this other form of propagandist content is going to look like, and what it means to them to be aligned with that same station, and whether or not that's acceptable. So that to me is refreshing, I should say, because now all the cards are on the table. For once, there, you know, the the emperor is naked, if you will. Like, it's all fairly self-evident, and we as audiences can make up our minds without any with scrupulous scrutiny, I should say, and with no false illusions about what anyone, you know, stands for, or appears to stand for, and that journalists can do the same. That we can judge and arbitrate good journalism on the basis of the works of individual journalists, not networks. So Al Jazeera should not be the one getting the awards. It's those individual journalists. I would recognize, you know, the various reporters and producers who are doing the fantastic work, not Al Jazeera the network, or Al Jazeera the, you know, the platform, or Qatar the funding agency. So I think that's an important thing, that the unit of good journalism is journalists.
And on that note, I think we should end because my timer has gone off several times. We were supposed to talk for 20 minutes. And I think this is a conversation that we should continue. I think
Yes.
one of the main questions that we ask on my program all the time is what is the role of journalists, especially when we see that there's sort of the confluence of interests. Especially we saw how again Trump became a cash cow
Hmm.
for so many reporters and for so many media, not report media outlets, I should say. And how after the 2016 they asked the wrong questions, and then they asked the wrong question, then again they asked the wrong
Yes.
question. So I think we are in a we are in a transformative era, and I think it's we are having conversations amongst media workers, journalists, um, and I think voices such as reporters who work for Al Jazeera or other networks, or you know, I mean, reporters who are from the Middle East and North Africa who writes in New York Times and New York Times and Washington Post and other outlets. I think this is an important conversation to have,
Yes.
and important conversation to have because our region is so much in trouble,
Hmm.
and there are so many uh, stories to tell about um, that vast region. And I think
Hmm.
that's why our role become even more critical
Absolutely.
to create that space to tell those stories. So I hope that we do that in these segments
Definitely.
with with other reporters, other journalists, media workers, and maybe the conversations that we have. And I'm hoping that people who are watching this can send us ideas,
Yes.
or they can chime in and say what they think, um, because I think media and the role that it plays, it's one of the most critical foundations of democracy. We can we can become a platform and conduit for those sort of conversations.
Absolutely.